Hello, Grace Lutheran. Pastor Matt Newpel here. I just wanted to make this video in response to several of our members at Grace who have expressed their concerns over the past few days about the Equality Act that was just recently passed by the House of Representatives and is now on its way to the Senate. For those watching who may be out of the loop, the Equality Act is essentially an amendment to the Civil Rights Act that includes discrimination laws that protect members of the LGBTQ community. To read from the actual bill itself, this is its stated purpose. It is the purpose of this act to expand as well as clarify, confirm, and create greater consistency in the protections and remedies against discrimination on the basis of all covered characteristics, meaning characteristics of sex and sexual orientation, and to provide guidance and notice to individuals, organizations, corporations, and agencies regarding their obligations under the law. Before we continue, I think this would be a good time to advise anybody who's watching this right now, no matter how you may feel about the Equality Act, when it comes to sensitive topics like this, personal issues, I do find that it's always best to go straight to the horse's mouth. Try your best to cut through a lot of the media bias that you find on either side, and instead try to read the bill itself in its full text. All of this is available online. It's very easily accessible at congress.gov. I will post the link in the description, but for those of you who are concerned about this and want to learn more, I always advise to go straight to the source. Read what's actually in this document for yourself to see what it's proposing and what it's not proposing. After reading the Equality Act myself, I do have several thoughts, to say the least. But before we begin this discussion, I also think it's important to start with the fact that as Christians, I think we should always be in favor of laws or things that are legislated by our civil government that offer protection from discrimination against a person on the basis of who they are or who they claim to be, or what group they claim as part of their identity. As Christians, we do confess that there is something sinful about humanity. But at the same time, because of the incarnation, because God entered into human nature in the person of Jesus Christ, we also confess that there is something sacred about humanity. Something that gives every human person dignity and worth because God has given humanity worth in Jesus Christ. Because of this, I believe that Christians should always be opposed to policies that prevent, for instance, a black person or a Muslim person from having access to basic daily needs because they are a black person or a Muslim person. Now, to bring things back around to our present discussion about the Equality Act, I think this does include, in a lot of ways, members of the LGBTQ community. For example, let's say you're a Christian who owns a bank. I do not believe that it's an appropriate Christian action for you to reject someone from taking out a loan or from opening an account because they are a member of the LGBTQ community. I do not believe that that is the biblical view of vocation. I don't believe that that's how God calls us to use the gifts that He's given us to be used in the world, to be used as a light to point others to Christ. Now, I understand the issue gets a little bit more complicated when it comes to business that deals specifically with affirming that view of the world and sexuality. For example, baking a cake for a homosexual wedding ceremony. The point I'm trying to make is that as Christians, I don't believe we should be necessarily opposed to the intent of the Equality Act. And I cannot put more emphasis on that word intent of the Equality Act. Of course, we believe that people should be treated with dignity and respect, no matter who they are, who they claim to be, what pronouns they use. Of course, we want everybody to have access to the freedoms that we all enjoy as citizens of the United States. These are principles that we as Christians should uphold and value. But what the greatest concern is to me is how the Equality Act seems to define sex and sexuality, and how, in my view, that is diametrically opposed to the biblical view of what sex and sexuality is. To once again go straight back to the source, this is how the Equality Act defines sex under Section 1101, Definitions and Rules. It reads, sex. The term sex includes A sex stereotype, B, pregnancy, childbirth, or a related medical condition, C, sexual orientation or gender identity, and D, sex characteristics including intersex traits. You may be wondering, well, what do they mean by gender identity? Well, lucky for us, we have a definition for that too. Under the same section, 1101, we read gender identity. The term gender identity means the gender-related identity, appearance, mannerisms, or other gender-related characteristics of an individual, regardless of the individual's designated sex at birth. By defining sex in this way, Congress is beginning their definition of sex and sexuality with the subjective individual experience, and not with sex as an objective truth that exists outside of ourselves. I understand that this is likely going to spark a much longer discussion in the future about LGBTQ and specifically transgender issues that pertains to the church. But for the time being, I just want to make the point that as Christians, I believe there is something about sex, about male and female, that we must hold as objective. In other words, there is something in the Bible that compels us to see an essence of being male and an essence of being female. In the first chapter of Holy Scripture, we see a very clear account of how God creates humanity. We read in verse 27, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them." From this we learn that sex, this distinction between male and female, is not something that was made up by humanity on its own, but it is a God-given characteristic that was imparted to the creation of humanity from the very beginning. Now, of course, this isn't to say that people cannot be confused about their sex or their male or female identity, but that may be a topic that we can discuss in a future episode. The point being that God has imparted to the created order of humanity something that is distinctly male and something that is distinctly female. With this in mind, I believe it's of utmost importance moving forward for the church to understand that our federal government, Congress, does not share the same view that many conservative Christians do about sexual identity and orientation. There's just one more thing about the Equality Act that I want to bring Grace Lutheran's attention to, and that's specifically how it deals with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993. As many of our listeners are already aware, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was passed in 1993 as a means to protect religious businesses, religious organizations, from specific federal laws that would prevent them from freely exercising their religion. Many of us still remember back in 2014 when the Religious Freedom Restoration Act became central to the Supreme Court case dealing with Hobby Lobby. Whether Hobby Lobby was within their rights to exempt their employees from the affordable care that would extend to providing contraceptives. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act is meant to provide religious exemptions to federal laws, but throughout the course of its history, it's been increasingly seen as a means for religious organizations to discriminate against members of the LGBTQ community. With that in mind, I want to take a moment to read the section of the Equality Act that deals with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Under Section 1107, it says, "The Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993 shall not provide a claim concerning or defense to a claim under a covered title or provide a basis for challenging the application or enforcement of a covered title. What this means is that the Equality Act is making an attempt to prevent a person or a religious organization from appealing to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act for support if they feel that they are being violated within their rights to freely exercise their religion. Now, there's a lot of what-ifs that we could play with this information that we have. What does this mean for the future of how churches operate and do ministry? Should the Senate pass this bill or something like it in the future? Will this mean that we have to accommodate a worldview that is diametrically opposed to our own? I'm not sure if we're going to have specific answers to that question anytime soon. We're going to have to see how the Equality Act plays itself out in the Senate, obviously being prayerful for our country, for our leaders who are wrestling with these decisions. But for us as the church, especially for us here at Grace, I want to encourage us to not get too wrapped up in these doomsday, worst-case scenario, what-if possibilities. On one hand, I do see a cause for alarm in the Equality Act as yet another reminder that our federal government no longer has the church's best interests in mind. But I believe we also have to ask ourselves, does the mission of the church change if the federal government reflects a different worldview than our own? And of course, the answer is no. The mission of the church has never changed. Whether it was during the time of Rome, when Christians were actively being killed and persecuted for their faith, or today, when we have a government that is increasingly going against the biblical worldview of how we see humanity and life. Now, this is not to minimize the concerns that I see within the Equality Act. As our mission dean, Pastor Stephen King, has advised, I also invite anyone at Grace to contact our local representatives in the government to let them know your concerns and thoughts about the Equality Act as someone who is a practitioner of a religion. This is something that I'm going to prayerfully consider doing myself, writing a letter as a local faith leader about my more detailed concerns about the Equality Act. But in the meantime, church, at the risk of sounding cliche, we have to continue putting our faith in the Lord, who has promised that he is going to be with us to the end of the age. There is no piece of legislation, there is no act or bill that can destroy the gospel. There is nothing that the federal government can do or say that can halt the progress of Christ's church. This is something that God has promised us in his word, and we uphold it as the church as true, that the church will continue until Christ comes again, and the gates of hell cannot prevail against that. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more news in the next few days about the Equality Act, especially as we wait to hear from the Senate on what they're going to do with it specifically. But in the meantime, stay tuned for more content dealing specifically with LGBTQ and transgender issues in particular. Feel free to comment below too if you have any more thoughts about the Equality Act. What are some of your biggest concerns with what you've read so far? Maybe something that wasn't mentioned in this video. Feel free to leave that below. But in the meantime, we ask that everyone continue to pray for our country, pray for our leaders as they wrestle through these decisions. But we also want to continue praying for the church in the United States, that the church could continue its mission to love God and to love our neighbors as ourselves, and to point others to Jesus Christ and to uphold biblical truth within our given context that God has placed us in. Thanks again for watching this video. We hope that it was informative and helped to give some clarity to the Equality Act. Be sure to check back again soon for more content. But in the meantime, we hope you have a great rest of your weekend. Take care, and God bless.